The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mahogany furniture of the Whitfield mansion on Fifth Avenue. Ruth Whitfield sat perfectly still as her mother's sharp voice cut through the drawing-room air like a blade through silk. "You've become quite the burden, haven't you?" Margaret Whitfield's lips pursed as she regarded her daughter with the same disdain one might reserve for a stain on fine linen. "First, Charles Ashford breaks off your engagement, and who could blame him? Now you sit here, 24 years old, withering away like last season's roses." Ruth's fingers tightened on the embroidery hoop in her lap, but she kept her eyes downcast. She'd learned long ago that meeting her mother's gaze only invited more cruelty. "Perhaps if you'd been more accommodating to Charles's needs, more agreeable to his wishes. He wanted things I couldn't give," Ruth said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Couldn't or wouldn't?" Her mother's laugh was brittle as winter ice. "No matter. Your father and I have found a solution to our little problem." Ruth looked up then, a flicker of alarm in her gray eyes. "Solution?" Margaret's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "You're to be married, a mail-order bride, they call it. How delightfully common." She savored the words like bitter wine. "Your father's business associate, Mr. Thornberry, wagered that he could find the most backwards, isolated creature in the territories, some illiterate cowboy who's never seen a proper lady. Won't he be surprised when New York society's biggest disappointment arrives at his doorstep?" The blood drained from Ruth's face. "You're sending me away as a jest. Think of it as an adventure, darling. Though I doubt you'll last a week before you come crawling back. The papers are already signed. You leave tomorrow." Ruth stood abruptly, her embroidery falling to the floor. "Mother, please." "The discussion is closed. Sarah will help you pack. Try not to embarrass us more than you already have." That night, Ruth sat by her bedroom window, watching the gas lamps flicker along the street below. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass, remembering Charles's parting words. "You're too proud, Ruth. Too stubborn. No man wants a wife who thinks she's his equal." But she hadn't been proud. She'd only been herself, 500 miles west, in a valley carved between the Wyoming mountains like a secret whispered by God. Eli Harper mended a fence post by the last light of day. His dog, Ranger, lay nearby, muzzle gray with age but eyes still alert for trouble. The ranch wasn't much to look at, a modest cabin with a lean-to barn, surrounded by acres of grassland that turned golden in summer and white with snow come winter. But it was his, built with his own hands after the war, when the nightmares had finally quieted enough for him to think about living instead of just surviving. Eli straightened, working the kink from his back, and noticed Ranger's ears perk up. A rider was approaching from the direction of Willow Creek, moving fast despite the gathering dusk. "Mr. Harper." Young Tom Bradley from the postal station pulled his horse to a stop, kicking up dust. "Got a letter for you, marked urgent." Eli wiped his hands on his worn denim pants before accepting the envelope. The paper was finer than anything that usually made its way to his corner of the world. "Much obliged, Tom." The boy lingered, clearly hoping for gossip. But Eli just nodded his thanks and waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded before breaking the seal. Inside the cabin, he lit a kerosene lamp and spread the letter on the rough wooden table. His reading was slow but careful, lips moving slightly as he worked through the formal phrases. "Dear Mr. Harper," he read aloud to Ranger, who'd settled by the stove. "Your request for a bride through our matrimonial service has been accepted. Miss Ruth Whitfield of New York City has agreed to the match." Eli sat back heavily. He'd written to the agency 6 months ago, in a moment of winter loneliness when the silence of the cabin had pressed against him like a living thing. He'd been honest about his circumstances, the modest ranch, the hard life, the scars that made his left hand clumsy sometimes. He'd never expected a response, let alone from a lady with such a refined name. The letter continued with details of her arrival. She would be on the westbound train in 1 week's time, arriving at the Willow Creek station. From there, it would be a day's ride to his ranch. Eli ran his good hand through his dark hair, already streaked with gray, though he was only 32. A wife. After all these years alone, he'd have a wife. He stood and walked to the small daguerreotype on the mantel. His parents, his brother James, all gone now. "Well, Ma," he said softly, "looks like you'll get that daughter-in-law after all." The week passed in a blur of preparations. Eli scrubbed the cabin until his knuckles were raw, mended the good quilt his mother had made, and even attempted to fix the loose board in the bedroom floor. He traded 2 chickens to Mrs. Patterson in town for a bar of lavender soap, and spent an afternoon picking wildflowers to dry for potpourri, though he wasn't entirely sure what potpourri was meant to do. On the appointed day, snow began to fall as Eli hitched his horses to the wagon. The flakes were thick and lazy, the kind that promised a proper storm by nightfall. He'd brought extra blankets and his father's old buffalo coat, hoping they'd be enough to keep a city lady warm on the long ride back. The train wheezed to a stop at Willow Creek Station just as the snow began to fall in earnest. Ruth clutched her valise with gloved hands, peering through the frost-covered window at the desolate landscape beyond. The platform was little more than wooden planks over mud, and the town consisted of perhaps a dozen buildings huddled against the wilderness like sheep before wolves. "End of the line. Miss," the conductor said, not unkindly. "You sure someone's meeting you?" Ruth lifted her chin, summoning every ounce of breeding her mother had beaten into her. "Quite sure, thank you." She descended onto the platform, her fine leather boots immediately dampened by the slush. The other passengers dispersed quickly, leaving her alone with her trunk and the growing certainty that she'd been abandoned in this God-forsaken place. Then she saw him. He stood by a weather-beaten wagon, tall and lean as a fence post, wearing a long duster that had seen better decades. His face was shaded by a worn hat, but she could make out strong features marked by sun and wind. When he removed his hat, revealing dark hair and serious eyes, she noticed he held it awkwardly with his left hand, as if the fingers didn't quite work properly. "Miss Whitfield?" His voice was deep and careful, like he was approaching a spooked horse. "Yes." The word came out more sharply than she'd intended. "I'm Eli Harper. Ma'am, I've come to... that is, I'm here to take you home. To the ranch." He cleared his throat. "If you're still willing." Ruth almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Willing? As if she had a choice. As if she could simply board the next train back to New York and face her parents' wrath. "Of course," she said coolly, adjusting her traveling cloak against the snow. "Though I must warn you, Mr. Harper, I am not what you expected." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or disappointment. But he simply nodded and moved to collect her trunk. "Roads are getting bad with the snow. We'd best make haste if we're to reach the ranch before full dark." He lifted her trunk into the wagon bed with easy strength, then turned to offer his hand. Ruth hesitated only a moment before accepting his help into the wagon. His palm was calloused and warm through her glove, steady as granite. As they pulled away from the station, Ruth caught sight of herself in a shop window, pale face pinched with cold, dark hair already escaping its pins, expensive dress woefully inadequate for the weather. She looked exactly like what she was, a fish gasping on dry land. "There's blankets behind the seat," Eli said without looking at her, "and I brought my father's coat. It ain't pretty, but it's warm." "I'm perfectly fine." Ruth lied through chattering teeth. He made a sound that might have been amusement. "Suit yourself, ma'am, but it's a long ride, and pride makes poor protection against a Wyoming winter." They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of wagon wheels and the soft snorting of the horses. Ruth pulled her cloak tighter, determined not to show weakness, but as the wind picked up and the snow thickened, her resolve wavered. Without a word, Eli pulled the wagon to a stop and reached behind the seat. He held out the buffalo coat, his expression carefully neutral. "Please, Miss Whitfield, I'd never forgive myself if you took ill on my account." The coat smelled of leather and wood smoke and something indefinably masculine. It engulfed her like a warm embrace. immediately cutting the wind's bitter edge. Ruth murmured her thanks, hating how grateful she felt. As they continued into the gathering dusk, Eli began to speak, his voice low and measured. The ranch isn't grand, just a cabin and some outbuildings. About 300 head of cattle. Got good water, though, and the land's honest. I want you to know what you're riding toward. Ruth studied his profile in the dying light. There was no boastfulness in his tone, no false modesty either. Just simple truth, laid out like cards on a table. Why did you send for a bride, Mr. Harper? The question escaped before she could stop it. He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, gets lonely out here. Man starts talking to his horse and dog like they might answer back. Figured it was time to try for something more. He glanced at her, then away. Why did you answer? Ruth thought of her mother's cold smile, of Charles's sneering dismissal, of the letter that had been signed without her knowledge or consent. I wanted a new beginning, she said, which was true enough, even if it wasn't the whole truth. Well, Eli said softly, Wyoming's good for that, if nothing else. The ranch materialized out of the snow like something from a fairy tale. If fairy tales featured rough-hewn logs and smoking chimneys instead of towers and turrets. Ranger bounded out to meet them, tail wagging despite his arthritic hips. Easy, boy. Eli called, We've got a lady present. Mind your manners. Ruth had never cared much for dogs, but something about the creature's honest joy made her extend a tentative hand. Ranger sniffed politely, then gave her glove a gentle lick. He likes you, Eli said, and for the first time, she heard warmth in his voice. That's a good sign. Ranger's got sense about people. Inside the cabin, Ruth stood frozen, not from cold, but from the shock of how small it was. The entire structure could have fit in her bedroom back home, with room to spare. One main room served as kitchen, dining, and living space, with a ladder leading to what she assumed was a loft. A door on the far wall presumably led to the bedroom, but it was clean. Ruthlessly, almost desperately clean. From the scrubbed floorboards to the gleaming windows. A jar of dried wildflowers sat on the table, and she could smell lavender soap beneath the wood smoke. It's not much, Eli said, setting down her trunk, but it's warm and dry. I've made up the bedroom for you. I'll take the loft until, that is, for as long as you need. Ruth turned in a slow circle, taking in the careful preparations, the obvious effort he'd made, for her, for a stranger he'd never met, who'd come to him through a letter full of lies. It's fine, she managed, her throat tight with an emotion she couldn't name. You must be hungry. I've got stew keeping warm, and Mrs. Patterson in town made fresh bread yesterday. He moved toward the stove, favoring his left side slightly. Coffee's hot if you'd like some. I don't drink coffee, Ruth said automatically, then winced at how ungracious she sounded. Tea, then? I think I've got some somewhere. He began searching through tins on a high shelf. Mr. Harper. When he turned, she forced herself to meet his eyes. I should tell you now. I can't cook. I can't sew anything practical. I don't know the first thing about cattle or chickens or anything useful. I'm going to disappoint you terribly. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, quietly, only way you could disappoint me, Miss Whitfield, is if you weren't honest, and seems to me you're being plenty honest right now. Something loosened in Ruth's chest. She sank onto the bench by the table, suddenly exhausted. Outside, the wind howled around the corners of the cabin, but inside, the stove crackled cheerfully, and the lamplight painted everything in warm gold. Tea would be lovely, she said softly. Thank you. As Eli busied himself with the kettle, Ruth caught sight of the daguerreotype on the mantel. A family, frozen in time, their faces serious but kind. Your family? She asked. Yes, ma'am. Parents passed from fever 8 years back. My brother James died at Antietam. He set a chipped but clean cup before her. It's just me and Ranger now. Well, he added with a ghost of a smile. And you, I suppose. Ruth wrapped her hands around the warm cup, breathing in the steam. Outside, the storm was building, cutting them off from the world. She'd come here as a cruel joke, a punishment for the crime of not being the daughter her parents wanted, but sitting in this simple cabin, watching this quiet man move about with careful grace despite his injury. She wondered if perhaps the joke might not be on her after all. The storm looks to be settling in, Eli observed. Might be a few days before the roads are passable again. I see, Ruth said, though she didn't really. She'd never been at the mercy of weather before, never been somewhere that civilization couldn't reach with a telegram or carriage ride. I'll leave you to get settled, he said, moving toward the ladder. Bedroom's through that door. There's water in the pitcher for washing. If you need anything, just holler. He paused at the bottom of the ladder, looking back at her. In the lamplight, she could see the lines around his eyes, the weight of loneliness he carried like an old wound. I'm glad you're here, Miss Whitfield, he said simply. Whatever the reason that brought you, I'm glad. Then he was gone, up the ladder with Ranger following slowly behind, leaving Ruth alone with her tea and the terrifying realization that she might have found the one place in the world where she could be exactly who she was, if only she could figure out who that might be. Ruth woke to a world of white silence and bitter cold. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The rough wooden walls were nothing like her papered bedroom in New York. Then it all came rushing back. The train, the snow, the quiet cowboy who'd given up his bed for a stranger. She sat up, shivering violently. The small stove in the corner had gone out during the night, and frost painted the inside of the windows like delicate lace. Her breath clouded in the air as she reached for her warmest dress, only to realize it was still woefully inadequate for this harsh climate. A soft knock came at the door. Miss Whitfield, I've got the main stove going. It's warmer out here. Ruth wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and opened the door to find Eli holding a steaming cup. He was already dressed, his hair damp as if he'd washed in cold water. Coffee, he said, then caught himself. Sorry, I forgot. I can make tea. Coffee is fine, Ruth said, accepting the cup gratefully. The warmth seeped into her frozen fingers like a blessing. Thank you. She followed him into the main room, where indeed the large stove radiated blessed heat. Ranger lifted his head from his spot on the rug, tail thumping a greeting. Pump's frozen, Eli said apologetically. I had to break ice on the water barrel. It'll thaw by midday if the sun comes out. He gestured to the table. Breakfast is just biscuits and preserves. I'm afraid, haven't mastered the art of much else. Ruth sat, trying not to let her dismay show. At home, breakfast had been served on china plates by silent servants, eggs cooked to perfection, fresh fruit, delicate pastries. Here, the biscuits were slightly burned on the bottom, and the preserves had crystallized in their jar. It's fine, she said, because what else could she say? She took a bite, surprised to find the biscuit was actually quite good despite its charred bottom. Did you make these? This morning. He looked pleased by her approval. My mother's recipe. She always said the secret was not overworking the dough. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. Ruth found herself studying him when he wasn't looking, the way he held his cup with his right hand, how his left lay carefully still on the table. There was a grace to his movements despite the injury, a quiet competence that spoke of years of self-reliance. I need to check the animals, he said eventually. Storm like this, they need extra feed. You're welcome to come along, but it's powerful cold. Ruth thought of staying in the cabin alone, with nothing to do but count the minutes until he returned. I'll come, she said impulsively, if I won't be in the way. Something softened in his expression. Never in the way, ma'am, though you'll need warmer clothes. I might have something that'll work. He disappeared into the lean-to and returned with an armload of garments. These were my brother's. He was slight-built, like you. They're not proper ladies' clothes, but they'll keep you warm. Ruth fingered the wool shirt. the heavy canvas pants. Part of her recoiled at the impropriety. Her mother would faint dead away at the thought. But her mother wasn't here. Was she? And propriety offered little protection against Wyoming winter. "Thank you," she said. "I'll just change." In the bedroom, Ruth struggled into the unfamiliar garments. The pants felt scandalous against her legs, but they were blessedly warm. The shirt hung loose, smelling faintly of cedar and long storage. When she emerged, Eli's eyes widened slightly. "Well," he said after a moment, "you look ready for ranch work." Sure enough. Outside, the cold hit like a physical blow. Ruth gasped, her lungs burning with the frigid air. Snow had drifted against the cabin walls, and more fell steadily from a gray sky. "Here." Eli wrapped a woolen scarf around her face, leaving only her eyes exposed. "Breathe through the wool. It helps." They trudged through knee-deep snow toward the barn. Ruth tried to step in Eli's footprints, but her shorter legs made it difficult. Once she stumbled, and he caught her elbow, steadying her with surprising gentleness. The barn was warmer, filled with the earthy smell of hay and horses. 3 horses stood in their stalls, ears pricked with interest at the visitors. A handful of chickens roosted in the rafters, feathers fluffed against the cold. "This is Duchess," Eli said, stroking the nose of a bay mare. "And that's Samson and Clara. The chickens don't have names, except for that red one. I call her Trouble because she's always where she shouldn't be." Ruth watched him work, noting how he compensated for his weak left hand, using his elbow and shoulder when needed. He forked hay into the stalls with economical movements, checked water troughs, scattered grain for the chickens. "What happened?" she asked suddenly, then flushed at her boldness. "Your hand, I mean, if it's not too forward to ask." He paused in his work. "Shiloh," he said simply. "Took grape shot to the shoulder and side. Surgeon wanted to take the arm, but I was stubborn. Kept it, but the nerves never healed right." He flexed the fingers slightly. "Works well enough for most things." "You fought for the Union?" "Illinois 45th Infantry. Joined up with James in '61. I was 19. Thought it would be a grand adventure." His voice held old bitterness. "Turned out to be more mud and blood than glory." Ruth had known men who'd fought. They'd returned to New York with missing limbs and haunted eyes, begging on street corners while society ladies hurried past. But Eli had built something here, despite his wounds. The courage of it humbled her. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "About your brother." He nodded, returning to his work. "Long time ago now, but thank you." They finished in the barn and made their way back toward the cabin. As they passed a small fenced area, Ruth noticed several wooden crosses standing stark against the snow. "Family plot," Eli said, following her gaze. "My folks, James, and my grandfather who first claimed this land." Without thinking, Ruth touched his arm. "You must miss them. Every day." He looked down at her hand on his sleeve, and she quickly withdrew it, cheeks burning despite the cold. "Gets easier with time, though. Everything does." Back in the cabin, Ruth's fingers were too numb to work the buttons on James's coat. She stood helplessly, frustrated by her own uselessness, until Eli noticed her struggle. "May I?" he asked quietly. She nodded, mortified. He worked the buttons free with his good hand, careful not to touch her more than necessary. This close, she could smell the cold clinging to him, mixed with something like pine and leather. "There," he said, stepping back quickly. "You'll warm up soon." Ruth busied herself hanging the borrowed clothes on pegs, trying to calm her racing heart. What was wrong with her? She'd been engaged to Charles, had danced with dozens of men at society balls, but something about Eli's careful courtesy, his deliberate distance, made her achingly aware of his presence. The day stretched before them, long and empty. Ruth tried to help as Eli went about his chores, but she was more hindrance than help. She didn't know how to stoke the stove without filling the room with smoke. Her attempt to wash the breakfast dishes resulted in more water on the floor than in the basin. Even simple tasks like sweeping seemed beyond her capability. "I'm sorry," she said for the dozenth time after knocking over the kindling basket. "I'm not usually so clumsy." "No need for apologies," Eli said patiently, gathering the scattered wood. "Different world out here. Takes time to learn." But Ruth could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. What use was a wife who couldn't cook, couldn't clean, couldn't do any of the 1,000 tasks that needed doing on a ranch? He'd sent for a partner, not another burden. That evening, as Eli prepared their simple supper of beans and cornbread, Ruth noticed him pause at the window, lips moving silently. Following his gaze, she saw the small cemetery, crosses barely visible in the gathering dusk. "Do you pray for them?" she asked. He glanced at her, seemingly surprised she'd noticed. "Every evening, started during the war, when James and I would pray for home. After he died, I kept it up. Feels like they're not so far away when I do." Ruth thought of her own prayers, the rote recitations learned in childhood, empty of real feeling. "What do you say?" "Nothing fancy. Just tell them about my day. What's happening on the ranch. Thank the Lord for another sunset, another sunrise coming." He smiled self-consciously. "Probably sounds foolish to a city lady." "No," Ruth said softly. "It sounds lovely." That night, as she lay in the borrowed bed listening to the wind howl around the eaves, Ruth thought about faith, not the showy religion of her mother's church, all proper appearances and social positioning, but something quieter, something that could sustain a man through war and loss and lonely years, that could make him pause each evening to speak to the departed as if they still listened. She must have dozed, because suddenly she was burning with fever, sheets soaked with sweat despite the cold room. Ruth tried to rise, but the room spun sickeningly. She called out weakly, not even sure what name to use. "Eli, Mr. Harper?" The door opened, and he was there, lamp in hand, concern creasing his features. "Miss Whitfield, what's wrong?" I don't feel well," she managed through chattering teeth. How could she be sweating and freezing at the same time? He set the lamp down and touched her forehead with the back of his hand. "Fever. Probably from the cold yesterday. I should have been more careful, not let you stay out so long." "Not your fault," Ruth whispered. "I wanted to go." He disappeared and returned with blankets, which he tucked around her with impersonal efficiency. "I'll heat some water. My mother always said fever needs to sweat itself out." Through the long night, he tended to her. Ruth drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes finding him placing cool cloths on her forehead, other times spooning water between her cracked lips. Once, she woke to find him sitting in the chair beside the bed, head bowed, that same silent prayer on his lips. "Don't die," she heard him whisper. "Please don't die. Not when you just got here." Ruth wanted to tell him she wouldn't die, that it was just a fever, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she reached out blindly until she found his hand, the damaged one. She squeezed gently, trying to convey what her voice couldn't. He stiffened, then slowly turned his palm to intertwine their fingers. "You're going to be fine," he said, and she couldn't tell which of them he was trying to convince. "Wyoming hasn't beaten you yet." By morning, the fever had broken. Ruth woke feeling wrung out but clear-headed, to find Eli asleep in the chair, their hands still linked in the pale dawnlight. She studied his face, the premature lines, the shadow of beard, the vulnerable curve of his mouth in sleep. This was to have been her punishment, her humiliation. Instead, this man, this stranger, had sat through the night, keeping watch, praying for her survival. When had anyone in her life ever shown such simple, unearned kindness? Eli stirred, eyes opening slowly. When he realized their position, he gently extracted his hand, color rising in his cheeks. "Fever's broken," he said unnecessarily. "How do you feel?" "Better," Ruth said. "Tired, but better. Thank you for everything." "No need for thanks. It's what anyone would do." But Ruth knew that wasn't true. Charles would have sent for a doctor and retreated to his club. Her mother would have complained about the inconvenience. Only this quiet cowboy had sat vigil through the dark hours, offering comfort without expectation of reward. "I'll make some broth," Eli said, rising stiffly. "You should eat something." As he left, Ruth caught sight of the borrowed clothes hanging on the pegs, the rough furniture, the simple decoration. Yesterday it had all seemed so foreign, so beneath her. But now, weakened by fever and touched by kindness, she saw it differently. This wasn't a punishment or a prison. It was a home, built by someone who understood loss and loneliness, who still found grace enough to pray at windows and tend to strangers in the night. Ruth closed her eyes, not to sleep but to offer her own prayer, not the formal words of her childhood, but something simpler. "Thank you," she thought, not sure if she was addressing God or fate or the universe itself. "Thank you for bringing me here. Help me be worthy of it." Outside, snow continued to fall, sealing them away from the world. But inside the small cabin, something had shifted in the night. Not love, not yet, but the first fragile foundation of understanding, built on gentle hands and whispered prayers and the quiet courage of kindness. The weeks following Ruth's fever marked a gradual transformation, like spring ice slowly melting on a river. Her city ways began to thaw under the patient warmth of ranch life. Each morning, she rose earlier, drawn by the sound of Eli moving about the cabin, starting the stove, beginning the endless cycle of chores that kept them fed and warm. "Hold it steady now," Eli instructed, guiding Ruth's hands on the kindling axe. "Let the weight of the blade do the work. You don't need to force it." Ruth brought the axe down, splitting the small log cleanly. She laughed, delighted by this small victory. "I did it." "You did indeed," Eli agreed, a rare smile creasing his weathered face. "Few more years of practice and you'll be a regular frontier woman." She mock glared at him, but there was no heat in it. These past weeks, she'd learned to bank the stove, to cook simple meals without burning them, mostly, and to navigate the cabin in the dark when nature called in the middle of the night. Each small accomplishment felt like a rebellion against everything her mother had tried to make her. "Tomorrow I'll show you how to handle the horses," Eli continued, stacking the split wood. "Duchess is gentle as a lamb. She'll be a good teacher." Ruth felt a flutter of nervousness. The horses were so large, so powerful, but she nodded, trusting him. She'd learned that Eli never pushed her beyond what she could handle, never mocked her failures, only offered quiet encouragement and endless patience. That evening, as had become their custom, they sat by the stove after supper. Ruth was mending one of Eli's shirts. Her stitches were crooked, but functional, while he cleaned his rifle, preparing for a hunting trip. "Tell me about before," Ruth said suddenly. "Before the war, what was it like here?" Eli's hand stilled on the gun. "Quieter," he said after a moment. "My folks had been here since '49, some of the first settlers in the valley. James and I, we had the run of the place, spent our days fishing in the creek, learning to track deer, helping Pa with the cattle." "It sounds wonderful," Ruth said wistfully. "Like something from a storybook." "Had its hardships, too. Lost 2 sisters to scarlet fever when they were just babies. Indians, Cheyenne mostly, would come through, sometimes peaceful, sometimes not. One winter the snow was so deep we couldn't get to town for 3 months. Lived on jerky and preserved vegetables till I thought I'd never want to see another turnip." Ruth smiled at that. "Still, you had each other. That must have counted for something." "Everything," Eli corrected softly. "Family was everything out here. Still is, I suppose, even if it's just memories now." They lapsed into comfortable silence. Ruth had learned to appreciate these quiet moments, so different from the constant chatter and social obligations of her former life. Here, silence wasn't empty. It was full of small sounds. The pop of wood in the stove, Ranger's gentle snoring, the wind singing around the eaves. The next morning dawned clear and cold. After breakfast, Eli led Ruth to the barn, where Duchess waited in her stall. The mare turned her large head to regard them with liquid brown eyes. "First thing is to let her know you're a friend. Eli explained. Hold out your hand. Let her smell you. Ruth extended her hand tentatively. Duchess's whiskers tickled as the horse investigated this new person. Good. Now, stroke her neck, firm but gentle. Horses can sense fear, but they can sense kindness too. Under his guidance, Ruth learned to brush the mare, to clean her hooves, to secure the saddle. When it came time to mount, she balked. She's so tall, Ruth said, eyeing the stirrup that seemed impossibly high. I'll help, Eli offered. Put your left foot here. Grab the saddle horn, and I'll boost you up. His hands were steady at her waist as he lifted her. Ruth settled into the saddle, heart racing from more than just nervousness. She was achingly aware of where he'd touched her, even through layers of winter clothing. How's that? Eli asked, adjusting the stirrups. Feel secure? Yes, Ruth managed, though she felt anything but. The ground seemed very far away. He showed her how to hold the reins, how to guide Duchess with gentle pressure. They started slowly, Eli leading the mare around the corral while Ruth concentrated on not falling off. Relax, he advised. You're sitting like you're in a church pew. Move with her. Don't fight against her. By the end of the morning, Ruth was riding independently around the corral, even managing a slow trot. When Eli helped her dismount, she was flushed with accomplishment. You're a natural, he said, and she glowed under the praise. As the days passed, their rides grew longer. Eli showed her the boundaries of his land, the hidden valleys where deer gathered, the best spots for summer grazing. Ruth began to understand the ranch as he did, not just as property, but as a living thing that required knowledge and care and respect. One afternoon, they rode to a grove of cottonwoods along the creek. The trees were bare now, but Eli described how they looked in summer, leaves shimmering silver green in the wind. James and I used to come here to fish, he said, dismounting and helping Ruth down. Caught my first trout right about there, where that rock juts out. They walked along the frozen creek, boots crunching on snow. Ruth noticed how Eli always positioned himself on her left side, his weak hand away from her. She wanted to tell him it didn't matter, that she didn't see him as diminished by his injury, but couldn't find the right words. Instead, she bent to examine some tracks in the snow. What made these? Rabbit, Eli said, crouching beside her. See how the back feet land ahead of the front? And these smaller ones here, that's a weasel, probably hunting the rabbit. He began teaching her to read the story written in the snow, where animals had passed, what they were doing, where they were going. Ruth found herself fascinated by this hidden world she'd never known existed. In the city, I never looked down, she admitted. Never noticed anything smaller than a carriage wheel. Different kind of surviving there, I expect, Eli said. But out here, knowing these signs can mean the difference between eating and going hungry. A large snowstorm moved in that evening, and by morning the world was transformed. Drifts reached halfway up the cabin door, and still the snow fell. Eli worked for an hour just to clear a path to the barn. Looks like we're stuck for a few days, he announced, stamping snow from his boots. Hope you don't get tired of my company. I think I'll manage, Ruth said dryly, hiding her secret pleasure at the prospect. These past weeks, she'd found herself looking forward to their conversations, to the way his eyes crinkled when he was amused, to the careful way he had moved through the world. They settled into a cozy routine. Mornings were for chores, even in the storm. The animals needed tending. Afternoons, they worked on indoor tasks. Eli taught Ruth to play checkers with a set his father had carved. She read to him from the few books in the cabin, the Bible, a worn copy of Pilgrim's Progress, and, surprisingly, a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets. James loved those poems, Eli explained when she expressed surprise. Used to quote them at the oddest times, drove the other soldiers half mad. Ruth chose one at random and began to read. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. She faltered, suddenly aware of the word's meaning, of Eli's steady gaze upon her. The cabin felt too warm, too small. That was one of his favorites. Eli said quietly. "Read it at his grave marker when I buried him." Ruth set the book aside. "Tell me about him. Really tell me." So Eli did. He talked about James's quick wit, his terrible singing voice, his unwavering optimism even in the darkest days of war. He told her about the last letter James had written, full of plans for after the war, a girl he wanted to marry, the cabin he'd build on the north pasture, the children who'd fill the valley with laughter again. "Sharpshooter got him at dawn," Eli said, staring into the fire. "He was bringing me coffee. Joked that it was strong enough to raise the dead. Then he was gone, just like that. Cup didn't even spill." Ruth reached across the small space between them and took his hand, the damaged one. She'd noticed he always kept it hidden, tucked in his pocket or behind his back. Now she held it gently, tracing the scars with her fingers. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For James. For all of it." Eli looked at their joined hands with wonder. "Most folks pretend not to notice, or they stare when they think I'm not looking." "I'm not most folks," Ruth said, surprising herself with her boldness. "No," Eli agreed, his voice rough. "You're not." The moment stretched between them, fragile as spun glass. Then Ranger barked at something outside, breaking the spell. Eli withdrew his hand gently, mumbling something about checking the woodpile. That night, the storm howled with renewed fury. Ruth lay awake listening to the wind, thinking about the man sleeping in the loft above. She'd come here as a joke, a punishment, a mail-order bride meant to humiliate a backward cowboy. But Eli was anything but backward. He was educated in ways that mattered, in kindness, in survival, in the quiet strength that endured loss without bitterness. And she was falling in love with him. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Love? How could she love someone she'd known mere weeks, someone so different from every man she'd ever met? But there it was, undeniable as the storm outside, this fierce tenderness that made her want to protect him even as he protected her. A loud crack split the night, followed by a crash that shook the cabin. Ruth sat up, heart pounding. Above, she heard Eli moving quickly. "Stay there," he called down, but Ruth was already wrapping herself in a shawl. The main room was chaos. A massive branch had punched through the roof, snow and wind pouring through the gap. Eli was trying to wrestle a piece of canvas over the hole, but with his weak hand, he couldn't manage alone. Without thinking, Ruth grabbed the other end of the canvas. Together, they fought to secure it while the wind tried to tear it away. Snow stung their faces, and the cold was brutal. But finally, they managed to nail the canvas in place. They stood panting, covered in snow. And suddenly, Ruth was laughing. It was absurd, standing in a broken cabin in a nightgown and boots, hair wild, hands numb from cold. But she felt more alive than she had in years. "What's funny?" Eli asked. But he was smiling too. "My mother would die," Ruth gasped between giggles. "Absolutely die if she could see me now." "Good thing she can't then," Eli said. "Though I think you look just fine." Their eyes met across the wreckage, and Ruth's laughter died. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a woman, not a burden or an obligation, but someone desired, someone precious. "Ruth," he said, her name a question and a prayer. She stepped toward him through the scattered debris. "Yes?" But whatever he might have said was lost as the canvas gave way again, dumping a fresh load of snow on their heads. By the time they'd secured it properly, the moment had passed. They cleaned up in companionable silence, sweeping snow, mopping water, stuffing rags in the gaps. "I'll fix it proper when the storm clears," Eli promised. Surveying the damage, "Might have to move into the barn if it gets worse." "At least it would be an adventure," Ruth said, wringing out her soaked shawl. He looked at her with that wondering expression again. "You've changed," he said softly. "When you first came, I thought the ranch would break you, but you're stronger than you look." "Maybe I just needed the right reason to be strong," Ruth replied, meeting his gaze steadily. They stood there, the broken roof above them, snow melting in puddles at their feet, and Ruth thought this might be the most perfect moment of her imperfect life. Tomorrow would bring repairs and revelations, confessions and complications. But tonight, they were just two people who'd weathered a storm together and come out whole on the other side. "We should get some sleep," Eli said finally. "Long day tomorrow." "Yes," Ruth agreed, though sleep was the last thing on her mind. As she returned to the bedroom, she paused at the door. "Eli, thank you for everything, for being you." He ducked his head, color rising in his cheeks. "Get some rest, Ruth, before the whole roof comes down." She closed the door, smiling. Outside, the storm was beginning to blow itself out, but inside Ruth's heart, a different kind of tempest was just beginning. She pressed her hand to the wood, knowing he was just beyond it, and whispered words she wasn't ready to say aloud. "I love you." In the main room, Eli stood staring at the closed door, his damaged hand pressed to his chest, where his heart beat wild as any storm. He'd sent for a wife out of loneliness, expecting duty and companionship at best. He hadn't expected Ruth, brilliant, brave Ruth, who faced blizzards and broken roofs with laughter, who held his scarred hand like it was something precious. "Lord," he whispered to the patched ceiling, "I don't know what I did to deserve her, but thank you. Thank you for sending her to me." Above them both, the storm clouds began to part, revealing the first stars Wyoming had seen in days. The morning after the storm dawned crystal clear, the kind of brilliant Wyoming day that made the snow sparkle like scattered diamonds. Ruth woke from restless dreams, confused images of Charles's sneering face morphing into her mother's cold eyes, telling her she was too proud, too plain, too much and not enough all at once. She dressed quickly, trying to shake off the lingering shadows. In the main room, Eli was already assessing the roof damage by daylight. "Worse than I thought," he said without turning. "Need to get to town for supplies. Weather's clear enough now, if you'd like to come." Ruth's heart leaped at the prospect of escaping the confines of the cabin, of seeing something beyond these four walls. "I'd love to." The ride to town took most of the morning. The fresh snow made travel slow, but the scenery was breathtaking. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks lost in clouds, while the valley stretched white and pristine between them. "Beautiful," Ruth breathed, reining Duchess to a stop beside Eli. "Wait till spring," he said. "Whole valley turns green as emeralds. Wildflowers everywhere. Indian paintbrush, larkspur, prairie roses. James used to say it looked like God spilled his paint box." They reached Willow Creek just after noon. The town looked even smaller than Ruth remembered from her arrival. A handful of buildings huddled along a muddy main street, fighting a losing battle against the wilderness. At the general store, Eli introduced her to Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, the elderly couple who ran the establishment. "So, you're the mail-order bride." "Mrs." Patterson said, looking Ruth up and down with shrewd eyes. "Heard Eli sent for a wife. Didn't quite believe it till now." Ruth felt heat rise in her cheeks but lifted her chin. "Yes, ma'am, I'm Ruth, from New York. Aren't you?" The woman's tone suggested this was barely a step above being from the moon. "Must be quite a change." "It is," Ruth agreed, "but a welcome one." Something in her tone must have convinced Mrs. Patterson, because the woman's expression softened slightly. "Well, any woman brave enough to take on this country, and Eli Harper has my respect. Man's been alone too long. About time he had someone to look after him." While Eli discussed lumber and nails with Mr. Patterson, his wife drew Ruth aside. "I've got some fabric that might interest you. That dress you're wearing is lovely, but not quite suited for ranch life." Ruth fingered her water-stained silk, one of the few she'd brought from New York. "I'm afraid I don't sew very well." "Nonsense. Every woman can learn. Come spring, we have sewing circles. You'll join us." It wasn't a question. As they prepared to leave, loaded with supplies, a familiar figure emerged from the saloon across the street. Ruth's blood turned to ice. Well, drawled a voice she'd hoped never to hear again. Ruth Whitfield, or should I say, Ruth Harper. Charles Ashford stood before them, immaculate despite the muddy street, his pale eyes glittering with malicious amusement. He looked exactly as she remembered, handsome in that cold, carved way, like a statue that might cut you if you touched it. "Charles," she managed. "What are you doing here?" "Business venture," he said smoothly. "Railroads coming through, you know. Smart men are buying land while it's cheap." His gaze flicked to Eli, who'd come to stand beside Ruth. "This your cowboy? How quaint." "Eli Harper," Eli said, extending his good hand. Charles looked at it for a long moment before shaking it briefly. "Charles Ashford, Ruth's former fiancé. I'm sure she's told you all about me." "No," Eli said simply. "She hasn't." Charles's eyebrows rose. "Really? How interesting. Well, I suppose some things are better left buried." He turned back to Ruth. "Though I must say, my dear, this is quite a step down from what you might have had. Still, I suppose beggars can't be choosers." Ruth felt Eli tense beside her, but before he could speak, she stepped forward. "You're right, Charles, I am a beggar. I begged for kindness and received cruelty. I begged for respect and received disdain. But here," she gestured to Eli, "to the mountains beyond. Here I don't have to beg for anything." Charles's smile turned sharp. "How poetic. Let's hope your cowboy doesn't tire of your particular charms as quickly as I did." "That's enough," Eli said quietly. There was something in his voice that made Charles step back. "Of course, I wouldn't want to keep you from whatever it is you do out here. Good day, Ruth, Mr. Harper." He tipped his hat mockingly and sauntered away. They rode in silence for several miles before Eli spoke. "You were engaged to him." "My parents arranged it," Ruth said, staring straight ahead. "I was young, and I thought it was what I wanted. He ended it 6 months later, said I was—" She swallowed hard. "Inadequate. Inadequate," Eli repeated flatly. "That man looked at you and found you inadequate? I wouldn't— that is, he wanted things from me, before marriage, things a lady doesn't do. When I refused, he said I was cold, unnatural, that no man would want a wife who couldn't show proper affection." Eli pulled his horse to a stop. "Ruth, look at me." She did, reluctantly, expecting to see disgust or disappointment. Instead, his dark eyes held a fury she'd never seen before. "That man," he said slowly, "is a fool and a cur. Any inadequacy was his, not yours. You hear me?" Tears pricked her eyes. "You don't understand. My own parents agreed with him, said I was too proud, too particular, that I should have been grateful for his attention, should have done whatever necessary to keep him." "Your parents were wrong." The certainty in his voice was like a rock to cling to. "A real man doesn't ask a woman to compromise her virtue for his pleasure. A real man waits. A real man respects." They continued toward home, but the encounter had shaken something loose in Ruth. That night, she couldn't settle. She paced the bedroom, memories crowding in, Charles's hands too rough, too insistent, her mother's shrill voice saying she'd die a spinster, the letter that had sealed her fate without her consent. Finally, she gave up on sleep and ventured into the main room. Eli sat by the dying fire, the Shakespeare sonnets open on his lap. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked without looking up. "Too many ghosts," Ruth admitted, settling on the other end of the bench. "Want to talk about it?" She was quiet for so long he probably thought she wouldn't answer. "Then, he made me feel like I was wrong, like the way I was made was somehow broken. Too cold, too proud, too everything." "You're not cold," Eli said softly. "I've seen you laugh at roof caves and cry over James's grave. That's not cold. But what if he was right? What if I'm not capable of being a proper wife?" Eli closed the book carefully. "Ruth, there's something I need to tell you, about why I sent for a bride." She waited, heart pounding. "After the war, after James, I came back here alone. For years. It was enough. The land, the work, the animals. But loneliness. It eats at a man, makes him do desperate things. So I wrote to that agency, figuring even a marriage of convenience would be better than talking to horses and ghosts. He turned to face her fully. But then you arrived, proud and scared and trying so hard to be brave, and every day since, you've surprised me, the way you've taken to this life, the way you've made this old cabin feel like home again. You think you're inadequate? Ruth, you're the answer to prayers I didn't even know how to pray. The tears came then, hot and healing. Eli moved closer, tentatively putting his arm around her shoulders. She turned into him, burying her face against his chest, breathing in the comfort of his solid presence. I'm scared, she whispered. Scared I'll disappoint you too. His hand came up to stroke her hair. Only way you could disappoint me is if you tried to be something you're not. I don't need a society wife who says all the right things and follows all the rules. I need you, Ruth, just as you are. She pulled back to look at him. This good man who saw her truly and didn't find her wanting. The firelight played across his features, highlighting the strength in his jaw, the gentleness in his eyes. Without conscious thought, she reached up to touch his face. He went very still. Ruth, I'm not cold, she said firmly. Not with you. The space between them vanished. His lips were warm and careful against hers, the kiss tender as a prayer. Ruth had been kissed before, Charles's demanding mouth, other men's polite pecks at society gatherings, but this was different. This was coming home. When they parted, both were breathing unsteadily. Eli rested his forehead against hers. I'm sorry, he said. I shouldn't have. Don't, Ruth interrupted. Don't apologize for the first real thing I've felt in years. They sat together as the fire died to embers, not speaking, not needing to. Ruth dozed against his shoulder, feeling safer than she had in memory. When the cold finally drove them to their separate beds, she carried the warmth of his kiss with her like a talisman against the dark. The next morning brought awkwardness. They moved around each other carefully, overly polite, achingly aware. Ruth burned the biscuits. Eli knocked over the water pitcher. Even Ranger seemed to sense the tension, whining uneasily. This is ridiculous, Ruth finally burst out. We're acting like children. Eli's shoulders relaxed slightly. Agreed. I don't want you to think I expect anything. Last night doesn't change the arrangement unless you want it to. What if I do want it to? The words came out barely above a whisper. He crossed to her in 2 strides, taking her flour-dusted hands in his. Then we change it, but slowly, carefully. You've been hurt before, and I won't add to that. We have time, Ruth, all the time in the world. She squeezed his hands, feeling the calluses and scars, the steady strength of them. I've never had that before. Time. I mean, everything in my life was rushed, scheduled, decided for me. This is new. Good new or bad new? Good, she said, surprising herself with a laugh. Very good. They spent the day working side by side to repair the roof. Ruth learned to hand him tools, to hold board steady while he nailed. When splinters caught in her palms, he removed them with gentle care. When the wind picked up, chilling her through, he wrapped his coat around her without being asked. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the snow pink and gold, they stood back to admire their work. The patch wasn't pretty, but it would hold. We make a good team, Eli observed. Ruth leaned into him slightly, testing. He responded by putting his arm around her, natural as breathing. Yes, she agreed, watching their shadows merge into one on the snow. We do. That night, she dreamed not of Charles or her mother or cold New York ballrooms, but of spring flowers and strong hands, and a future written in hope instead of fear. When she woke to find snow falling again, she smiled. Let it snow. Let the winter rage. She was no longer afraid of being trapped. She was home. The rider appeared at midday like a shadow against the snow, moving fast down the valley trail. Ruth saw him first from where she was hanging laundry on the line Eli had strung between the cabin and barn. Something about the urgency of his approach made her stomach clench with premonition. "Eli," she called, and he emerged from the barn, immediately alert. The rider was Ben Morrison from the stage station. His horse lathered despite the cold. "Harper," he called out, not even dismounting. "Thought you should know. Been some talk in town. About your missus. That fancy fellow Ashford's been running his mouth, saying she was sent here as some kind of joke. Says her family paid to have her shipped out here to humiliate some backward cowboy." Ruth felt the blood drain from her face. Beside her, Eli had gone very still. "Says he's got a letter to prove it," Ben continued, looking uncomfortable. "Sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but figured you deserved to hear it straight." "Appreciate it, Ben," Eli said quietly. His voice sounded strange, distant. After Ben left, they stood in terrible silence. The wet clothes on the line snapped in the wind like accusations. "Is it true?" Eli asked finally, not looking at her. Ruth's throat closed. She wanted to lie, to deny, to make this go away, but she'd learned the value of truth in this place. "Yes." He flinched as if she'd struck him. "All of it." "I didn't know at first," she said desperately. "My parents arranged it without telling me. They signed the papers, told me I was going west as a mail-order bride. It wasn't until the train that I overheard other passengers talking, laughing about the wager, about teaching some ignorant rancher a lesson. And you came anyway." "I had nowhere else to go." The words burst out of her. "They would have thrown me out on the streets. At least here, I thought... "You thought you'd play along with the joke." His voice was flat, dead. "Live here a few days, have a good laugh, then leave." "At first, yes," Ruth admitted, tears streaming down her face. "But then I met you, and you were kind and patient and nothing like what they said, and I started to see a life here, a real life, and I—" "Don't." He held up a hand. "Just don't." He turned and walked back to the barn. Ruth stood frozen, watching him go, feeling her new world crumble around her. She'd known this moment would come, had dreaded it, but somehow she'd let herself believe that what they'd built together could withstand the truth. Inside the cabin, she moved mechanically, folding laundry, stoking the fire. Her hands shook as she wrote, *Eli. I came here as part of a cruel joke. That much is true. But everything that happened after, every moment, every word, every feeling, that was real. You showed me kindness when I deserved none. You gave me a home when I was lost. You made me believe I could be more than the disappointment my family saw. I'm leaving because you deserve someone who came to you honestly, not wrapped in lies. You deserve someone worthy of the life you've built here. I'm sorry for everything, but mostly I'm sorry that in trying to stay, I hurt the best man I've ever known. Ruth *. She left the letter on the table, packed her few belongings into her valise, and put on her traveling dress, now mended and practical rather than fine. The money she'd hidden in her trunk would get her to Denver, maybe San Francisco. She could find work, start over, try to forget. Outside, snow was falling again. Ruth pulled on the buffalo coat. She'd leave it at the stage station for someone to return to him. She couldn't bear to take anything that was his. The walk to town would take hours in this weather. Ruth set out anyway, her boots crunching through fresh powder. Behind her, the cabin grew smaller, disappearing into the white. She made it perhaps 2 miles before the storm worsened. Wind drove ice crystals into her face, and the trail disappeared under fresh drifts. Ruth pressed on, driven by guilt and grief, until her foot caught on a hidden root and she tumbled down a small embankment. Pain shot through her ankle. When she tried to stand, it buckled beneath her. Ruth crawled to the shelter of a large pine, shivering violently. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd flee to preserve Eli's dignity, and instead would die in a snowbank, causing him more trouble. Time lost meaning in the white swirl. Ruth dozed, woke, dozed again. She dreamed of warm fires and strong hands, and a voice calling her name. The calling grew louder, more desperate, and she realized it wasn't a dream. "Ruth! Ruth! Answer me!" She tried to call back, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. Then Ranger was there, barking excitedly, and Eli was sliding down the embankment, his face wild with fear. "You fool woman," he said roughly, gathering her into his arms. "You beautiful, infuriating fool." He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, bad hand and all, and carried her to where Samson waited. The ride back to the cabin passed in a blur of pain and cold, and the solid warmth of Eli's chest against her cheek. Inside, he settled her in the chair by the fire and knelt to examine her ankle. His hands were gentle, but his jaw was tight with suppressed emotion. "Not broken," he said finally. "Sprained bad, though. You won't be walking anywhere for a while." "I'm sorry," Ruth whispered. "I was trying to make things right." By dying in a blizzard? How exactly would that make things right? He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "I read your letter." Ruth closed her eyes, waiting for his anger, his disgust. "You want to know what hurt most?" He continued. "Not that you came here as a joke. I can understand that. Desperate people do desperate things. Not even that you lied, because you tried to tell me the truth these past weeks in a dozen small ways." He turned to face her. "What hurt was that you were so ready to leave. First sign of trouble and you run, like what we've built means nothing." I thought you'd want me gone." "Why? Because some New York fools played a cruel game? Because you got caught in the middle of it?" He shook his head. "Ruth, I've known soldiers who enlisted for bounty money and became heroes. Known thieves who found religion and became preachers. How something starts doesn't determine how it ends. But you must hate me," Ruth said, "for deceiving you, for being part of their mockery." Eli crossed to her chair and knelt again, taking her cold hands in his. "I could never hate you. I was hurt, yes, angry. But then I found your tracks leading away, and all I could think was that you were out there alone, in danger, because you thought I wouldn't forgive you. Can you forgive me?" "Already done," he said simply. "Question is, can you forgive yourself? Can you stop running from happiness because you think you don't deserve it?" Ruth looked into his earnest face, this good man who'd ridden into a blizzard to find her, who offered forgiveness as easily as breathing. "I don't know how." "Then we'll learn together, same as you learned to split wood and ride horses, one day at a time." He helped her to the bedroom, supporting most of her weight. As he turned to leave, she caught his sleeve. "Stay," she said softly. "Please, I don't want to be alone." He hesitated. "Ruth, just stay, nothing more. I need to know you're really here, that I didn't lose you." Slowly, carefully, he stretched out on top of the covers beside her. Ruth curled into him, her head on his shoulder, finally letting the tears come. He held her as she wept, for the girl she'd been, for the woman she was becoming, for the future that had almost slipped away. "No more secrets," she whispered when the storm of weeping passed. "I promise. No more running," he countered. "Promise me that. I promise." They lay quietly as the storm raged outside. Ruth dozed, waking periodically to assure herself he was still there. Once, she woke to find him watching her with such tenderness it took her breath away. "What?" she asked. "Just thinking how close I came to losing you, not to the storm, before that. If you'd gotten on that stage." He tightened his arm around her. "I've lost too much already. Parents, James, the use of my hand. I couldn't lose you too." "You won't," Ruth said fiercely. "I'm not going anywhere. This is my home now. You're my home." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Sleep. We'll sort the rest tomorrow." But Ruth couldn't sleep. She lay listening to his heartbeat, thinking about forgiveness and second chances and the strange paths that led to love. Her parents had sent her here to be humiliated, but instead, she'd found dignity. Charles had called her cold, but in Eli's arms, she burned with warmth. "Eli?" she whispered. "Thank you for coming after me." "Always," he murmured. "Always come after you, Ruth." In the morning, her ankle was swollen, but the pain was manageable. Eli carried her to the main room, settling her with her foot propped up. He moved around the cabin with his usual quiet efficiency, but she caught him glancing at her often, as if reassuring himself she was still there. "Stop looking at me like I might vanish," she said finally. "Can't help it," he admitted. "Keep thinking I'll wake up and this will all have been a dream. You, here, choosing to stay even after—" "Especially after," Ruth corrected. "Now I know for certain I'm here by choice, not circumstance. That makes all the difference." He brought her breakfast, slightly scorched eggs and perfectly golden biscuits. "Been thinking," he said as they ate, "about what Morrison said, about Ashford spreading tales." Ruth's appetite vanished. "What about it?" "Man like that won't stop. He'll keep talking, keep trying to hurt you, hurt us." Eli set down his fork. "Unless we give him no ammunition." "What do you mean?" "I mean," Eli said carefully, "that if we were properly married, really married, not just this arrangement, he'd have nothing to say that mattered." Ruth's heart stuttered. Are you proposing?" "I'm proposing we make real what's already true." He said, "You said I'm your home. Well, you're mine too. Have been since the day you walked into this cabin and tried to pretend you weren't freezing to death out of pure pride." "Eli Harper," Ruth said, "are you saying you fell in love with me because I was stubborn?" "Among other reasons," he agreed, a smile playing at his lips. "So what do you say? Will you marry me, really marry me, not because of some letter or arrangement, but because you want to?" Ruth thought of all the reasons she should say no. They'd known each other mere weeks. She'd come here under false pretenses. She still couldn't cook worth a damn. Then she thought of all the reasons that didn't matter. The way he'd held her through fever, his patience as she learned, the forgiveness he offered as easily as breathing, the future stretching before them, no longer frightening but full of promise. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." His smile transformed his face, years falling away until she glimpsed the boy he must have been before war and loss marked him. He crossed to her chair, cupping her face gently. "You sure?" "More sure than I've ever been about anything." He kissed her then, deep and sure and full of promise. When they parted, both were breathless. "Soon as the weather clears, we'll go to town," he said. "Do this proper, unless— would you rather wait? Have your family come?" Ruth laughed, sharp and bright. "My family forfeited any right to witness my happiness when they shipped me out here like unwanted goods. No, this is our beginning. Ours alone." "Good," Eli said firmly, "because I don't think I could be civil to people who couldn't see what a treasure they had in you." Outside, the storm was finally breaking. Weak sunlight filtered through the windows, making the ice crystals sparkle like nature's confetti. Ruth reached for Eli's hand, both hands, damaged and whole alike, and held on tight. "No more jokes," she said. "No more lies, no more running, just us." "Just us," he agreed. "That's all I ever wanted anyway." The influenza came like a thief in the night, stealing through the valley on the heels of a January thaw. Ruth first noticed something was wrong when Eli didn't rise at his usual hour. She found him still abed in the loft, his face flushed with fever, sheets soaked with sweat. "Just tired," he mumbled when she pressed a hand to his burning forehead. "Be fine in a minute." But he wasn't fine. Within hours, the fever had him in its grip, alternating between bone-rattling chills and sweats that left him gasping. Ruth had seen influenza in New York. It swept through tenements and mansions alike, but there had always been doctors to call, medicines to procure. Here, she was alone with her fear and whatever knowledge she could summon. She managed to get him down from the loft, though it took all her strength and his delirious cooperation. The bedroom was warmer, closer to the main stove, easier for her to tend him. She stripped the sweat-soaked clothes from him with clinical efficiency, trying not to think about how still he lay, how shallow his breathing had become. "Don't you dare," she whispered fiercely as she bathed his fevered skin with cool cloths. "Don't you dare leave me now." Eli Harper. Not when we've just found each other. For 3 days, she barely left his side. She spooned water between his cracked lips, made thin broths he couldn't keep down, changed sweat-soaked sheets until her hands were raw from washing. When the fever spiked dangerously high, she packed snow around him despite his delirious protests. On the second night, he began calling for James. "I'm coming," he muttered, reaching for something only he could see. "Wait for me. Brother, just wait." "No," Ruth said firmly, catching his hand. "James is gone. Eli, but I'm here. I'm right here. And I need you to stay with me." His eyes opened, but didn't see her. "Ruth left," he said sadly. "Storm took her. My fault. Should have told her. Should have said." "Said what?" she asked. Heartbreaking. "Love her," he whispered. "Love her so much it hurts. But she's gone. Everyone goes." Ruth pressed her face against their joined hands, tears falling freely. "I'm not gone," she said. "I'm right here, my love, right here." She climbed onto the bed beside him, cradling his burning body against hers. If she could have taken the fever into herself, she would have done it gladly. Instead, she held him and talked about the future they'd have, the ranch they'd build together, the children who'd fill the cabin with laughter. She painted pictures with words of spring flowers and summer gardens, of harvest dances and winter evenings by the fire. "Stay with me," she whispered over and over. "Please stay." The third night was the worst. Eli's breathing became labored, rattling in his chest like dry leaves. Ruth had seen that sound before, had watched it claim neighbors and friends. Panic clawed at her throat. "No," she said aloud to the empty room. "No, I won't let you take him." She worked with desperate energy, brewing willow bark tea the way Mrs. Patterson had mentioned, keeping the fire hot to fill the room with steam. She rubbed his chest with the camphor oil she found in his mother's old medicine box, praying it would ease his breathing. When he began to shake with chills, she stripped to her chemise and pressed against him, giving him her warmth. Propriety be damned, she'd scandalize the entire territory if it meant saving him. "Ruth?" His voice was barely a whisper, but his eyes were clear for the first time in days. "I'm here," she said, afraid to hope. "Thought I dreamed you. No dream, though you've been trying your best to leave me." She tried for lightness, but her voice cracked. "Never," he murmured. "Promised. Always come for you." "Then come back to me now," she said fiercely. "Fight this. Fight for us." He squeezed her hand weakly before sliding back into fevered sleep. But it was different now. Real sleep. Not the terrifying unconsciousness of before. His breathing eased, and when she checked, the fever had finally broken. Ruth wept then, great, gulping sobs of relief and exhaustion and love. She stayed pressed against him, monitoring each breath, each heartbeat, afraid to believe the crisis had passed. Dawn came gray and gentle. Eli woke properly, weak but lucid, to find Ruth still curled against him. "You stayed," he said wonderingly. "Where else would I be?" He touched her face with trembling fingers. "You look terrible." She laughed, knowing it was true. She hadn't bathed or changed in 3 days, hadn't eaten more than crackers, hadn't slept more than minutes at a time. "You're not exactly at your best either," she informed him. "Ruth," his voice grew serious. "I remember, did I say things about loving you?" Heat flooded her cheeks. "You were delirious, fevered." "People say all sorts of things when I meant it," he interrupted. "Every word. I love you. Ruth Whitfield. Have since the day you stood in my cabin in your fancy dress, chin up, pretending you weren't scared out of your mind." "Oh," she breathed. "Is that all right? I know we haven't known each other long, and you probably don't." She silenced him with a kiss. Gentle at first, then deeper as he responded. When they parted, both were breathless. "I love you too," she said simply. "Completely, desperately, eternally, eternally," he repeated, a smile ghosting across his pale lips. I like the sound of that. The recovery was slow. Ruth became nurse and caretaker, roles that would have been unthinkable to the pampered girl who'd arrived on that snowy platform. She made simple broths that gradually grew heartier as Eli's appetite returned. She helped him walk the short distance from bed to chair, supporting him when his weakness frustrated him. "I hate this," he said one afternoon, after she'd had to help him with the most basic of tasks. "Hate being helpless. Now you know how I felt when I first arrived." Ruth said pragmatically, "You were patient with me. Let me be patient with you." She read to him from the Shakespeare sonnets, sewed by the window where he could see her, told him stories of her childhood that made him laugh. Slowly, incrementally, his strength returned. One evening, 2 weeks after the fever broke, Ruth was preparing their supper when she felt arms slip around her waist. She leaned back into Eli's embrace, savoring his solid warmth. "You shouldn't be up," she said without conviction. "I'm fine, better than fine." He turned her to face him. "Ruth, these past weeks, you saved my life. You saved mine first," she pointed out. "From the storm, from myself. We're even—" "No," he said seriously. "Not even close. You could have left when I got sick. Could have gone to town, sent someone else to deal with me. Instead you stayed, fought for me, gave me your own warmth when I had none." "Of course I stayed," Ruth said, puzzled. "Where else would I be but with the man I love?" Something shifted in his expression, a heat that had nothing to do with fever. He pulled her closer, and she could feel the strong beat of his heart against her chest. "Ruth," he said, her name a question and a prayer. "Yes," she answered, knowing what he was asking, knowing her answer with bone-deep certainty. He kissed her then, different from before, deeper, hungrier, full of need too long denied. Ruth responded with equal fervor, her hands tangling in his hair, her body pressing against his. "You're still weak," she managed when they broke for air. "Not that weak," he said, and proved it by lifting her easily, carrying her to the bedroom despite her half-hearted protests. What followed was a revelation. All her mother's warnings, all Charles's cruel insinuations, fell away in the face of Eli's gentle reverence. He touched her like she was precious, kissed her like he was drowning and she was air. When she stiffened, nervous and uncertain, he gentled her with whispered endearments and infinite patience. "We have time," he murmured against her throat. "All the time in the world. Nothing happens unless you want it to." "I want," Ruth said, surprising herself with her boldness. "I want everything. With you." In the aftermath, they lay entwined, Ruth's head on Eli's chest, listening to his heartbeat, strong and steady. No trace of the frightening weakness of his illness. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, hand stroking through her tangled hair. "More than all right," Ruth said, pressing a kiss to the scar on his shoulder. "I didn't know. Nobody told me it could be like that." "Like what?" she thought, searching for words. "Sacred," she said finally. "Like a prayer made flesh." He tilted her chin up to look at her. "You're not sorry. How could I be sorry for the most beautiful thing that's ever happened to me?" She traced patterns on his chest, marveling at the freedom to touch him. "My only regret is that we're not yet married in the eyes of God. Soon as the road's clear," Eli promised, "I'll make an honest woman of you yet." "I think," Ruth said, "you already have." They dozed, woke to explore each other anew, slept again, outside. Snow began to fall, but inside their sanctuary, spring had already arrived. When morning came, Ruth woke to find Eli watching her with an expression of such tenderness it took her breath away. "What?" she asked, suddenly shy. "Just thinking how beautiful you are. How lucky I am. How I nearly died without telling you proper how much you mean to me." "No more almost dying," Ruth said firmly. "I forbid it." "Yes, ma'am," he agreed with a smile. "Though if this is how you nurse me back to health, I might consider a relapse." She swatted him playfully, then squeaked as he rolled her beneath him, kissing her thoroughly. "I love you," he said against her lips. "Today, tomorrow, always, always." She agreed, pulling him down for another kiss. Later, dressed and attempting normalcy over breakfast, they kept catching each other's eyes and smiling like fools. The world outside was frozen and harsh, but inside the cabin, love had transformed everything. "We should check the animals," Eli said without much conviction. "We should," Ruth agreed, making no move to rise. They sat holding hands across the table, unwilling to break the spell of their new intimacy. Finally, duty won. They bundled up and ventured into the cold, but even chores seemed lighter now. Ruth helped in the barn, no longer a burden but a true partner. As they returned to the cabin, Eli caught her hand. "Ruth, thank you for staying, for fighting for me, for loving me despite everything." "Not despite," Ruth corrected. Because of everything you are, your kindness, your strength, your patience, your impossibly noble heart. You're my miracle. Eli Harper, my answered prayer." He kissed her there in the snow, and Ruth thought of the girl she'd been, cold, proper, unloved, and marveled at the woman she'd become in this wild place. In this good man's arms. "Come on," she said, tugging him toward the cabin. "Let's go home." "We are home," Eli said, but followed her anyway, into warmth and light and the promise of all their tomorrows. Ruth woke in the gray hour before dawn, wrapped in warmth that had nothing to do with blankets. Eli's arm lay heavy across her waist, his breath steady against her neck. For a moment she simply lay there, marveling at this new reality, waking beside him, belonging to him in all ways but the official one. The thought sobered her. They'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, given themselves to each other without the blessing of church or law. In New York society, she'd be ruined. But here, in this simple cabin with this good man, she felt only whole. Eli stirred, tightening his hold. "Too early," he mumbled into her hair. "The animals," she reminded him, though she made no move to rise. "Let 'em wait." He pressed a kiss to her shoulder. "Rather important things happening here." She turned in his arms to face him. In the dim light, she could just make out his features, the strong line of his jaw, the tender curve of his mouth, the eyes that looked at her like she was miraculous. "Eli," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice her concerns. "What is it?" He was instantly alert, reading her mood. I need to know this is real, that you won't wake up one day and regret." He silenced her with a kiss, deep and sure. When they parted, his expression was fierce. "Listen to me, Ruth Whitfield. I will never regret loving you, never regret what we've shared. My only regret is that I can't marry you this very minute. But what if people talk? What if they find out then they'll know I'm the luckiest man in Wyoming," he said simply. "But if it troubles you, I'll sleep in the loft again until we can get to town, until I can make you my wife proper." "No," Ruth said quickly, clutching at him. "Don't leave me. I couldn't bear it now." "Then I won't. Simple as that." He stroked her hair back from her face. "We'll go to town as soon as the weather permits. Father Miguel will marry us. And then let anyone try to say a word against my wife." His wife. The word sent a thrill through her. "You really want to marry me? Even knowing how I came here? Even after everything?" "Especially after everything," Eli said. "You've seen me at my worst. Weak, fevered, barely able to stand. You stayed anyway. Fought for me. Loved me. How could I want anyone else?" They rose reluctantly, duty calling despite the pull to remain cocooned together. Ruth prepared breakfast while Eli tended the fire, but they kept finding excuses to touch, his hand on her waist as he passed, her fingers brushing his as she handed him coffee. "We're acting like fools," Ruth said, but she was smiling. "Happy fools," Eli corrected. After breakfast, he disappeared into the bedroom, returning with something wrapped in faded calico. "This was my mother's," he said, offering it to her. "Been waiting think she'd want you to have it." Ruth unwrapped it carefully, gasping at what lay within. A ring, simple but beautiful. A small sapphire surrounded by tiny pearls, set in gold that had been worn smooth by years. "It's beautiful," she breathed. She wore it every day for 30 years, Eli said. Never took it off. Not for washing, not for working. Pa saved for 2 years to buy it for her. He took the ring, holding it up. Ding. I know we're not married yet. Not official. But I'd like you to wear it, if you're willing, as my promise. Ruth held out her hand, which trembled only slightly. The ring slipped on as if made for her, the sapphire catching what little light filtered through the window. Yes, she said simply. To everything. Always yes. He kissed her then, and they might have forgotten the chores entirely if Ranger hadn't barked insistently at the door. The day passed in a golden haze. Everything felt new, the familiar chores transformed by shared glances, stolen kisses, the weight of the ring on Ruth's finger. Even the endless winter couldn't dampen their spirits. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Ruth asked, "Will you take me to James's grave tomorrow? I'd like to pay my respects properly." Eli's hand tightened on hers. "You don't have to. I want to. He was important to you, which makes him important to me. And I think he'd want to know that you're not alone anymore." The next morning dawned clear and bright. They made their way to the small cemetery, Ranger trailing behind. The crosses stood stark against the snow, but there was peace here too, in the way the mountains cradled the valley, in the eternal quiet. Eli brushed snow from James's marker with gentle hands. "Hey, brother," he said softly. "Brought someone to meet you. This is Ruth, my Ruth. You'd like her. She's got spine enough for 10 people and a tongue sharp enough to keep me in line." "Hello, James," Ruth said, feeling only a little foolish. "I want to thank you for making Eli the man he is, for the stories and laughter you gave him to sustain him through the dark times. I promise I'll take care of him now." She laid a small bouquet of dried flowers at the base of the cross, wild flowers Eli had gathered for her, now preserved and tied with a ribbon from her hair. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Eli spoke again. "I'm getting married, James. For real this time. Found someone who sees past all the broken pieces to what's underneath. Think you were watching out for me. Sending her here." The wind whispered through the pines, and Ruth could almost imagine it was an answer, a blessing from beyond. As they walked back to the cabin, Eli seemed lighter somehow, as if sharing this sacred space had lifted some last barrier between them. "Thank you," he said, "for understanding, for not thinking me foolish for talking to the dead. They're not really gone as long as someone remembers them." Ruth said, "My grandmother told me that once. I didn't understand then, but I do now." That afternoon, they were surprised by visitors. Mrs. Patterson and her daughter Mary, come to check on them after hearing about Eli's illness. "Land sakes, Eli Harper, you look like death warmed over." "Mrs." Patterson declared, bustling in with a basket. "And Ruth, girl, you look exhausted. Have you been nursing him all alone?" "I'm fine," Ruth assured her. "We're both fine now." But Mrs. Patterson's sharp eyes had already noted the ring on Ruth's finger. Her expression softened. "Well now," she said, "that's your mother's ring, isn't it, Eli?" "Yes, ma'am," Eli said, meeting her gaze steadily. "About time," the older woman said with satisfaction. "Martha Harper was my dearest friend. She'd be pleased as punch to see it on Ruth's hand." Mary, a girl of perhaps 17, gazed at Ruth with open admiration. "Is it true you're from New York? What's it like there? Did you have beautiful dresses?" Ruth smiled, remembering her own younger self. "Beautiful and uncomfortable. I much prefer what I wear here. It lets me actually do things." They spent a pleasant hour visiting, Mrs. Patterson filling them in on town gossip while Mary peppered Ruth with questions. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Patterson pulled Ruth aside. "You've got the glow about you," she said quietly. "The look of a woman well loved. I'm glad. Eli's been alone too long, and you've been good for him." Ruth blushed but didn't deny it. "He's been good for me too." "Marriage is hard work, even when there's love. And out here, Mrs. Patterson gestured to the wilderness beyond the windows. It's harder still, but I think you've got what it takes. You've already survived your first Wyoming winter. That's trial by fire right there. After they left, Ruth found Eli standing by the window, a strange expression on his face. "What is it?" she asked, going to him. "Just thinking how different you are from when you arrived. Then, you could barely hide your horror at this place. Now you're giving advice to young girls about the freedom of frontier living." "Are you saying I've gone native?" Ruth teased. "I'm saying you've come home," he said seriously. "And I'm so grateful I get to witness it." That night, as they lay together, Ruth traced the scars on his chest, the old war wounds, the newer marks from ranch life. Each one told a story of survival, of stubborn perseverance against odds. "Do they hurt?" she asked. "Sometimes, when the weather changes. Mostly." He caught her hand. "But they remind me I'm alive, that I survived when so many didn't. They're not pretty, but they're part of me." "They're beautiful?" Ruth said firmly. "Because they're yours, because they show how strong you are." "Ruth," he said wonderingly, "how do you do that? Make me feel whole when I've spent years feeling broken?" "The same way you do it for me," she said. "By seeing truly, by loving anyway." They made love slowly, savoring each touch, each whispered endearment. Ruth thought of all the cold beds she'd slept in, all the lonely nights when she'd wondered if she'd ever know this kind of connection. Now she couldn't imagine sleeping without Eli's warmth beside her. "I love you," she whispered against his skin. "So much it frightens me sometimes." "Don't be frightened," he murmured. "I'm not going anywhere. Neither are you. We're stuck with each other now." "Good," she said fiercely. "Because I'd fight anyone who tried to take you from me. I'd fight God himself." "Bloodthirsty woman," Eli said with fond amusement. "My bloodthirsty woman." They drifted off to sleep, wrapped around each other, the ring on Ruth's finger catching the moonlight like a promise made solid. In the morning, they woke to clear skies and the sound of melting snow. Spring was still weeks away, but there was a softness to the air that spoke of change coming. "Roads might be clear enough to get to town soon," Eli observed over breakfast. "Good," Ruth said. "I want to be your wife in all ways, not just the ones that matter most. They all matter." Eli said, "But yes, I want God's blessing on us. Want the whole world to know you're mine." "Possessive man," Ruth teased. "When it comes to you, yes." His expression grew serious. "Ruth, when we marry, you know it's forever? No divorce, no going back to New York if you decide this life is too hard?" Ruth reached across the table to take his hands. "Eli Harper, I have never been more certain of anything in my life. This is my home. You are my home. Forever isn't long enough." He lifted her hands to his lips, kissing each palm. "Then let's go make it official just as soon as we can." "Yes," Ruth agreed, her grandmother's ring warm on her finger, her heart full to bursting with love for this man who'd shown her what it meant to truly live. "Let's go home." Outside, the sun climbed higher, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of gold and promise. Inside, two souls who'd found each other against all odds began planning a future neither had dared dream of alone. Spring came to Wyoming like a miracle, melting the snow to reveal the earth beneath, brown and patient and ready for new life. Ruth stood in the doorway of the cabin, breathing in air that no longer burned her lungs with cold, watching Eli work in what would become their kitchen garden. "Seeds won't plant themselves," he called, grinning at her. She joined him, kneeling in the dark soil, marveling at how natural it felt now, her hands in the earth, the sun on her face. This man beside her planning for seasons to come. "Carrots here," he said, showing her how to make the rows. "Potatoes there, and over here, your flowers." "My flowers? Wrote away for them special. Roses, like ladies have in their gardens back east. Figured you might miss them." Ruth's throat tightened. "You ordered roses for me?" "Well, they might not take to Wyoming soil, but seemed worth trying." He ducked his head, suddenly shy. Want you to have beautiful things." "I already do," Ruth said, touching his face. "The most beautiful thing." They'd been married 2 months now. Since that bright March day when Father Miguel had blessed their union in the tiny church in Willow Creek, Mrs. Patterson had served as witness, crying openly, while her husband grumbled about women and their tears even as he wiped his own eyes. The ceremony had been simple. No white dress or flower girls, no society orchestra or champagne reception. Just Ruth in her best wool dress, Eli in his Sunday clothes, and promises made before God and a handful of frontier folk who'd become their community. "Do you take this woman?" Father Miguel had asked. "I do," Eli had answered, his voice strong and sure. "Today and always." "Do you take this man?" "With all my heart," Ruth had said, not caring that it wasn't the traditional response. "Now!" As spring painted the valley in shades of green, Ruth could hardly remember the frightened, angry woman who'd stepped off that train. That woman would never have imagined finding joy in planting vegetables, in watching calves take their first wobbling steps, in the simple pleasure of her husband's hand in hers as they surveyed their land. "Ruth," Eli said one evening as they sat on the porch he'd built, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple, "I've been thinking about the future." "Oh." She leaned into him, content. "The railroad's coming through next year. Land prices will go up. If we're careful, save what we can, we could buy the Paulson place when they move to California. More land, more opportunity. Build a real herd, maybe hire some hands come round up." He paused. "Make a legacy for our children." Ruth's hand moved instinctively to her still flat stomach. She'd been meaning to tell him, waiting for the right moment. About that, he turned to look at her, and she saw the hope dawning in his eyes. "Ruth, are you—" "Late summer, I think, maybe early fall," she smiled tremulously. "Are you happy?" For answer, he pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was spun glass and steel all at once, precious and strong. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," he said roughly. "A baby. Our baby." "Babies," Ruth corrected. "Eventually, I don't intend to stop at one." "Greedy woman," he said, but he was grinning like a fool. "My beautiful, greedy woman." They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked over the promise of new life, until Eli spoke again. "Will you miss it? Not having your mother here, or women from your old life?" "How could I miss what never really was?" Ruth said pragmatically. "My mother would have been horrified. A grandchild born in a cabin, raised on a ranch. No, this baby will have what I never did. Parents who love each other, who'll love him or her without conditions." "Him or her will also have to muck stalls and chase chickens," Eli warned. "Character building," Ruth said firmly, making him laugh. As her pregnancy progressed, the community of Willow Creek embraced her fully. Mrs. Patterson appointed herself unofficial grandmother, bringing remedies for morning sickness and advice for everything else. Mary helped sew tiny clothes, exclaiming over each miniature garment. Even the men treated her differently, tipping their hats, offering their seats, inquiring after her health with touching concern. She'd become one of them, a frontier wife instead of a city curiosity. One day, in late summer, as Ruth struggled to bend over her growing belly to pick beans, unexpected visitors arrived. A fine carriage, out of place on the rutted ranch road, pulled up to the cabin. Ruth's blood ran cold as her mother stepped out, followed by a man she didn't recognize, some lawyer, by his dress. "Ruth," Margaret Whitfield said, her gaze taking in her daughter's simple dress, work-worn hands, and obvious pregnancy with clear distaste. "What have you done to yourself?" "Hello, Mother," Ruth said, straightening with effort. "You're a long way from New York." "I've come to bring you home," her mother announced. "This ridiculous game has gone on long enough. Mr. Ashford has agreed to overlook your indiscretion. You can still be married properly." "I am married properly," Ruth said. "This is my home." Margaret's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. This hovel? My dear girl, you're living like a peasant. And clearly, her gaze dropped to Ruth's belly. That man has taken advantage of your innocence. That man, Eli said, appearing from the barn, is her husband, and you're not welcome here if you've come to insult my wife. Margaret barely glanced at him. I'm sure you've enjoyed your little joke, Mr. Harper, but the game is over. Ruth is coming home where she belongs. I belong here, Ruth said firmly. With my husband and our child. Child. Margaret's face went white, then red. You stupid girl. You've ruined everything. Do you know what people are saying? Do you know what you've cost us socially? I know what it cost me to be your daughter, Ruth replied. Years of being told I wasn't good enough, pretty enough, obedient enough. Years of being a disappointment. Well, I'm done disappointing you. Mother, I'm done trying to be what you wanted. You'll come now, Margaret said coldly. Or be cut off entirely. No inheritance, no acknowledgement. You'll be dead to society. Ruth actually laughed. Society? What has society ever done for me but judge me lacking? As for inheritance, keep your money. I have everything I need. She moved to stand beside Eli, who put his arm around her protectively. I have a husband who loves me for who I am, not who he can make me become. I have a home we've built together, friends who accept me, and a child coming who'll grow up knowing they're wanted. What could your money possibly add to that? Margaret's face contorted with rage. You ungrateful— I think the lady asked you to leave, Eli said, his voice steady but with an edge of steel. I'll ask you once more, polite-like. Don't make me ask a third time. The lawyer touched Margaret's arm. Mrs. Whitfield, perhaps we should— This isn't over, Margaret hissed, but she allowed herself to be led back to the carriage. As they drove away, Ruth sagged against Eli. She'll make trouble. Let her try, he said grimly. This is Wyoming territory, not New York society. Your name is on the ranch deed alongside mine. We're legally married. That baby you're carrying is legitimate. She's got no power here. I know, Ruth said. It's just, some part of me still hoped she'd be happy for me. Foolish, I know. Not foolish. Hopeful. Nothing wrong with hope. He kissed her temple. Come on, let's forget about her. Got more important things to think about. Like what we're going to name this little one. Summer turned to fall in a blaze of golden aspens and crisp mornings. Ruth grew round as a pumpkin, moving more slowly but still determined to do her share. Eli watched her like a hawk, ready to catch her if she stumbled, to carry what she couldn't lift. I'm pregnant, not broken, she reminded him for the 100th time. Humor me, he said. Never had a pregnant wife before, still learning the rules. The first pains came on a September night when the harvest moon hung full and bright. Ruth had been restless all day, and when the contractions started, she knew. Eli, she said, gripping the table. It's time. His face went white, then determined. I'll get Mrs. Patterson. No time. Ruth gasped as another pain hit. The baby's coming now. What followed was the longest and shortest night of both their lives. Eli, who delivered countless calves and foals, found himself terrified by the process when it was his wife laboring. But he stayed calm for her, boiling water, gathering clean cloths, holding her when the pains grew fierce. You're doing so well, he murmured, supporting her as she pushed. So brave, so strong. Don't feel brave, Ruth panted. Feel like I'm being torn in half. Nearly there, he promised. I can see the head, dark hair like yours. One final push and their daughter slid into the world, announced her arrival with a cry that was the most beautiful sound either had ever heard. A girl, Eli said, his voice thick with emotion as he placed the baby on Ruth's chest. Perfect little girl. Ruth looked down at the tiny face, the rosebud mouth, the impossibly small fingers, and felt her heart expand beyond what she'd thought possible. Hello, little one, she whispered. I'm your mama. They named her Hope for the future, for what she represented, for the emotion that had carried them both through darkness to this moment of light. Mrs. Patterson arrived the next morning to find them all asleep, Ruth in bed with Hope at her breast, Eli in the chair beside them. one hand resting protectively on his daughter's back. "Well now," the older woman said softly, "if that isn't the prettiest picture I ever saw." As fall turned to winter, their first as a complete family, Ruth often found herself standing by the window, watching Eli carry Hope around the ranch, introducing her to the horses, showing her off to Ranger, who'd appointed himself guardian of this new small human. "Look at that," she heard him tell Hope one evening as sunset painted the sky. "All this will be yours someday, this whole valley. Far as you can see, your mama and I will teach you to love it like we do." Ruth joined them on the porch, taking Hope so Eli could wrap his arms around them both. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "That I'm not the wife you expected when you wrote to that agency?" "Every day," he said, and before she could be hurt, he continued, "Every day I'm grateful you're not what I expected. I asked for a companion to ease loneliness. Instead, I got a partner, a lover, a best friend. I got someone who sees my scars and calls them beautiful. Someone who makes me laugh, makes me think, makes me want to be better than I am." "Eli Harper," Ruth said, tears pricking her eyes. "Are you trying to make me cry?" "Just speaking truth," he said. "Question is, do you regret it? This life, so far from what you knew." Ruth thought of the girl she'd been, privileged but unloved, surrounded by luxury but empty inside. That girl had died somewhere between New York and Wyoming, and Ruth couldn't mourn her. "Never," she said firmly. "That wasn't life. It was just existing. This, you, Hope, our home, our future. This is living." Hope stirred in her arms, making the small sounds that preceded hunger. Ruth turned to take her inside for feeding, but paused at the door. "Eli, remember when you said I was the answer to prayers you didn't know how to pray? Every word." "Well, you were the answer to mine too. I just didn't know I was praying until you answered." They went inside together, their small family complete. As outside the first snow of winter began to fall, no longer a threat, but a promise of cozy evenings by the fire, of seasons turning as they always had, of love that endured through blizzards and blooming equally in storm and sunshine. In the years that followed, the Whitfield family never contacted them again, but letters came occasionally from old friends. Amazed at Ruth's transformation, she answered them sometimes, trying to explain how a person could find themselves by losing everything they'd thought mattered. The ranch prospered. More children came, sturdy boys and spirited girls who grew up knowing they were loved, who learned to read the land and the sky, who carried forward the legacy their parents had built from loneliness and courage and unexpected love. And on quiet evenings, when the children were abed and the ranch was peaceful, Ruth and Eli would sit on their porch, hands linked, watching the stars wheel overhead. Two souls who'd found each other across impossible odds, who'd built a life from the ashes of old dreams. "Still happy?" Eli would ask. "Still grateful?" Ruth would answer, and in the vast Wyoming sky, the stars seemed to shine a little brighter, blessing a love that had begun as a cruel joke and become the greatest truth either had ever known. Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story. If you enjoyed Ruth and Eli's journey, I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more tales of frontier romance and adventure. What did you think of their story? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's discuss this beautiful tale of unexpected love blooming in the harsh but magnificent Wyoming territory.